says, I'm going to recuse myself. And I said, why the hell didn't he tell me that before I put him in? Russia, 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 Russia. My wife said, you never spoke to anybody from Russia, darling. I said, that's right. President Trump is waiting for the Mueller report. He's bad. He's a bad guy. But you know what I like about this? Number one, I'm in love, and you're in love. We're all in love together. We've done something that nobody's ever done. Hey, Don, how you doing? Hey, Donnie. I love you, Donnie. For 35 years now, they call Mr. President, sir. How are you? Trains to Hawaii. How do you get to Europe? We haven't figured that one out yet. We don't use airplanes anymore. Is doing well, except, of course, for the never-Trumpers. But they are on mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. You don't get rich by sitting behind a desk, so I didn't want to do that. And I'm in the White House, and I was lonely. I said, let's go to Iraq. Okay, General Raisin Cane, how fast can... Sir, we can have it totally finished in 1 week. I said, 1 week? And yet I see senators that are there for 20 years. White hair. See, I don't have white hair. Yes, I agree with this. This speech should have been delivered 1 year from now, not now, damn it. Because they're going to grip together. They're going to say, you know, this guy's really laying for us. I should have saved the Pocahontas thing for another year. Instead, we believe in free speech, including online and including on campus. Today, I'm proud to announce that I will be very soon signing an executive order requiring colleges and universities to support free speech if they want federal research dollars. Who does this? Other countries say, get the hell out of here. They will execute the baby after birth. Donald Trump should not, under any circumstance, they're trying to take you out with bullshit, okay? With bullshit.
For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively. And she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, you know, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. But I decided to try her more restricted diet. And first of all, it was just meat and greens, and then I stopped eating greens too about 5 months ago, and her mother has been doing the same thing for about 8 months. And the consequences have been, they're hard to believe. I don't even really like to talk about them because I'm not a dietary expert, and it sounds so completely insane. But I lost 52 pounds in 7 months.
52 pounds?
Yeah. And I wasn't overweight. Well, I was, but not by modern standards. No. And you know, a year before that, I had cut all the sugar out of my diet, okay? But I was still eating carbohydrates of all sorts.
Happy birthday, Dad. I love you very much. You're getting absolutely no presents because I figured 5 grandchildren is enough. And when you get the guy, you're good. When you get the most powerful guy in the world, anything's going to be a letdown. So we love you, and I look forward to seeing you soon because I don't get to see him that much anymore. That's the only problem.
Make him real happy. Buy him one of his ties for
I
Father's
will do
Day.
that because he doesn't have enough of those.
Trump should Stormy Daniels be able to speak, sir? Mr. Trump, should Stormy Daniels be able to speak?
Thanks, guys. That's not what we're talking about.
What are they going to do in the midterms? Because a lot of Democrats are going to be running in districts that
emails. Let's start with the first email. First of all, let's talk about who is Rob Goldstone.
Been very much interested in his philosophical and logical work. I think much of it is very insightful, very valuable today, still not entirely understood in many respects. But the other is his dedication to serious causes.
I can't bear the thought of many hundreds of millions of people dying in agony only and solely because the rulers of the world are stupid and wicked.
In World War I, he was in jail protesting the war. He was pretty much excluded from polite British society. Trinity College, his college, essentially threw him out. And then again, he was demonstrating in his late 70s, early 80s in Trafalgar Square and about the Vietnam War and nuclear war. In fact, he was asked once, why are you wasting your time with demonstrations when you could be working on logic and philosophy and doing something of lasting significance? He said, if I'm not out there demonstrating, there won't be any around to read the logic and philosophy.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Hello. Chief economist David Kriska.
How's it going?
Where's your McConaughey at? All right, that works. Super producer David Slavic. He's roaming the digitosphere in the ever-expanding, ever-global TMBS universe. On this week's program, Ben Burgis. He is the author of the forthcoming Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. We're going to be talking about a whole lot of things, including the hyperbolic title of today's show, but how logic, how argumentation can be enlisted for the socialist cause, and how it fits into building a broader, healthy culture and strategic one on the left. Joe Biden might be jumping into the race, and we got to remind you of at least some of the things that he is. Almost all of them really bad. Mike Bloomberg is out, but the centrists met for a fantasy party, the Niskanen Center. Keynote Tony Blair.
The Niskanen.
Fuck out of here. All of that and much, much more in the post game. In the main show, we're going to stand with Ilhan Omar. Late breaking reports that the cowardly and craven Democratic leadership might be backing off of having a vote. We're still going to back her up regardless. Griscom has an economic update. We've got a whole bunch of news for you. Let's get to it. So, this past weekend was the tale of two legendary social democrats. And let's start with Bernie Sanders, who was out for his first campaign weekend this Saturday and Sunday. Saturday in Brooklyn, Sunday in Chicago. David Griscom and I were both at Brooklyn College, and I could tell you that it was real. The atmosphere was electric. The speeches were powerful. The message is serious. He is the front runner, and he is undeniably the strongest candidate if you have legitimate progressive left commitments. It was something, in his message that he really is starting to integrate more threads. We'll talk later in the postgame about ways that they can continue to improve. But the synthesis that he's putting forward, still within a broad banner of a class-based politics, of a 99% versus the 1% based politics, and also of an affirmation of basic values like empathy, compassion, and love, were clearly and unapologetically articulated. Let's first start with this sound of him talking about the criminal justice system and economic justice as part of these threads he was building.
We are going to change a system in which tens of thousands of Americans every year get criminal records for possessing marijuana, but not one major Wall Street executive went to jail for destroying our economy in 2008. No, they didn't go to jail. They got $1 trillion bailout.
And Bernie's continuing the work of his 2016 campaign that inspired so many. And as he highlighted many times, and maybe the disappointment at times, and I was there. We're going to play this in a second. And there was an interesting dialectic because on one hand, there's no doubt that Bernie needs to center his biography and where he's coming from more in this campaign. And they did that. Sean King attested to his history of activism, as well as a family that was directly impacted by the Holocaust, really in a way that really belies and puts to shame people that would throw that old white man trope at him. It's in fact a real tremendously anti-Semitic and offensive act of erasure, if you want to use those terms. So he needed to come out. He needed to talk about where he was coming from and what he was about, and they did that. That's an important part of a campaign. There is a narrative arc to these things. It can't just be policy arguments. And at the same time, he's rightfully uncomfortable with the notion of this being a personality cult sort of upward campaign. And it manifested in this funny moment that we were there for. And you probably could have heard me laughing, actually, across the quad when this happened.
Giving us Vermont weather, thank you. And thank you all for being part of a political revolution which is going to transform America. Thank you. No, it is not Bernie, it is you.
He was legitimately almost irritated at that point. And I could tell from the side that when the finger went up, I said, wait for it. It's not me. It's you. It is all of us. And what he's doing there, though, is he's evoking his great hero, Eugene Debs, who built a mass movement and said he was inspired and who aspired to build mass politics in this society. That's also why later in the speech, Bernie did an interesting reformulation of Obama's no red states or blue states, but instead of a kind of false pretend commonality. He said most of us are workers across those states, and we can band together on those lines. That's a very powerful, very distinct message. And so, he echoed Debs in that. And then he went on in this final clip that we'll play to talk about why he believed, in a very activist sense, we can come together and actually win this campaign.
So this is what I believe. This is what I believe from the bottom of my heart. If we do not allow Trump and his friends to divide us up, if we stand together, black and white and Latino, Asian American, Native American, if we stand together, urban and rural, north, south, east, and west, if we stand together not as red state and blue state, but as working people fighting for dignity. If we stand together, believing in justice and human dignity, if we stand together, believing in love and compassion, if we stand together, brothers and sisters, the future of this country is extraordinary, and there is nothing we will not be able to accomplish. Thank you all very much.
This is an activist campaign, and Bernie Sanders made it clear, Nina Turner made it clear, Sean King made it clear, all of the great speakers up on that stage made it clear that this campaign is going to hinge on the grassroots, people going door to door, people actually making it happen. And there's going to be a huge amount of lies and venom and distortion targeted at Bernie. And I think partially in some ways, and of course, I'll always add, he's not perfect. There's grounds for legitimate criticism. But the critiques that come from the right and the center and the technocracy, part of it is clearly this profound dislike of somebody that is an activist. And I can't help but connect this to the other great news of another great social democratic leader from this past weekend, one who's currently a political prisoner. And of course, that's Lula da Silva, who we talk about frequently on this show, both because the jailing of him without any material evidence is a travesty of justice, an insult to the world in and of itself, and also because his imprisonment is what has allowed Brazil to embark on its far-right U.S. subservient gangster path under the Bolsonaro government. He almost certainly would have won the 2018 election had Brazilians been able to freely vote, and he was not barred by a corrupted judiciary process. We mentioned a couple of months ago or several weeks ago that Lula's older brother, who died of lung cancer, Lula was not allowed to go to his funeral. Again, in another undermining of Brazilian law. This past weekend, tragically, even more tragedy, his grandson, who was 7 years old, died of meningitis, and the Brazilian system decided to allow him to attend the funeral, probably because denying that would be just sort of, even for them, too much bad PR. Although in a since deleted tweet, Bolsonaro's son said that Lula should not be allowed to go and it would allow him to pose as a quote-unquote poor thing. These are the types of people we're dealing with. This is a clip of Lula, or first this is a photo, actually. Let's put this up first. I took this, and you can ignore my inscription around it. But look at the security around this man, including what actually I've discovered was this is actually a Brazilian officer who for some reason has a Miami SWAT team badge or pin or a patch on his vest. I have no idea why. At first, we thought that this was some type of American paramilitary, but apparently this is a Brazilian guard who also does who's done security work for Bolsonaro, and just, I don't know, like other weird, fascists can be embarrassing cosplay enthusiasts like anybody else. Contrast this, though, this sort of obscene treatment of this man who brought 40 million Brazilians out of poverty. We also have some video of Lula as well. And here he is. He's coming into the funeral, being greeted by supporters, surrounded. He's getting back in after going to the funeral of his grandson. Does the wave. This is an incredible bull right here. And obviously people demonstrating for him and demanding his freedom. This release should be permanent. Later in the day, we won't play this clip as of now, but police officers broke the arm of a local Workers' Party leader as well. And there's actually a lot of activism happening around Carnival right now in Brazil. But just as Lula faces the brunt and the abuse of the venom, the elite who want to keep us even from the most mildest of worker and racial empowerment from coming into being, and even from prison, he's still able to inspire opposition to the reactionary forces that have taken power. And he's been keeping touch with activists as best he can. And much like Bernie in the wake of the Trump victory, Lula is attempting, even for prison, to do the crucial work of rebuilding a political movement in response to the crisis faced by the Workers' Party and Brazil. Both Lula and Bernie continue their work for a better world, and it's undoubtedly clear that we will not create a fairer, more equitable, and beautiful world without the development of an organized, committed, and mobilized working-class movement. This is the challenge we face today as we reflect on those two leaders. And as always, feel the burn and Lula Livre. We're going to get to the shout-out, and this is going to be a little bit of an extended, we've already given Ilhan Omar, I think, how many shout-outs? At least one.
Not enough.
Not enough.
I think 3 at this point.
She's the best person in Congress. I'm going to put that on the line. Are we going to do the song for 10 seconds?
Let's get to the shout-out.
Wouldn't it be cool if Ilhan Omar called in and she was just like, could you play the song without interrupting? Because I like that. The anarchy song.
This is crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. That's creepy.
Yeah, it is actually, in fact, out of control, creepy, and weird, the way that the Democratic Party is considering moving forward with a disgusting vote to censure Ilhan Omar. I was willing a couple of weeks ago to have a discussion about how this issue can be communicated on more effectively, both because anti-Semitism is a real thing and also because disingenuous, cynical people will use anything to undermine talking about apartheid in the Middle East. And that's, in fact, what this is. Ilhan Omar has shown extraordinary courage and commitment, as well as a willingness to listen to people of good faith, of which there is almost no one in Washington, D.C., and that's why this racist, Islamophobic, disgusting charade continues. This is in West Virginia, or this was at CPAC, rather.
Nope, this was at the West Virginia event.
This is a West Virginia Republican
State
event.
House.
State House?
Yeah, it was at the State House. It looks like the Kanawha County Republicans.
Okay, so this is a poster, if you're not watching this, and you can look it up quite easily if you have access to it. This is a Reuters video? Of basically it says, you said never forget, and it's a photo of the attack on the Twin Towers. Yeah, we can just pause. You don't need to play anymore. And then underneath it, it's a photo of Ilhan Omar, and it says, I am proof you have forgotten. I mean, this is some of the this is not only base bigotry and grotesqueness. This is in an environment of white nationalism from the Republican Party on down of, I would say, incitement to violence. And the Democratic Party leadership is not only not having this person's back, they're considering censuring her in what some of them, like Congressman Burgis, have been pretty honest about, which is that you can't criticize Israel as a sovereign nation state with a policy.
It's not appropriate.
It's not appropriate. Could you imagine if you insert any other country in that sentence? Iran, France, Jamaica, Senegal. It's a demented, ludicrous, disgusting comment. This is Ilhan Omar today demonstrating why she is in fact such an exceptional leader.
And so I don't ever want you guys to worry about me. Can't help but truly. You know, Rashida sent me a text message. She said, I know you told me you survived the war and you're tough, but I really just want to come give you a hug. And I said, I don't need a hug, and I truly did survive a war. I'm fine. I am fine. I know what my mission is. I know what my purpose is. I know that as long as I breathe, that I will continue to make people uncomfortable in the best way possible. So you can send me your prayers and whatever support that you see fit. But I don't ever want you to lose sleep about an article you read about me.
So we need to have her back 100%. I'll say personally, and I don't. I mean, I've contributed to Bernie because obviously I think that undertaking is incredibly important. But I did take yesterday to send, nothing massive, but I definitely contributed money to her congressional campaign. That to me felt like a tangible effort to counteract what is a mass act of political terrorism facing her. And everybody needs to support her completely, fully, and unequivocally. There's no room for prevarication and bullshit. She is right on all of the merits of the policy questions. Incidentally, she has spoken out quite clearly on Saudi Arabia. That's a problematic formulation. If a Jewish congressperson criticized a dictatorship in another part of the world, I wouldn't immediately say, well, what's your position on the occupation? So that's a problem in and of itself. But that being said, I'll register that she has. And in fact, most people that are going to come into Congress and have an honest appraisal of a place like Saudi are going to be precisely the ones who are most likely to buck the consensus on a foreign policy built on Israel and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, and ones that are going to question an ongoing commitment to both of these states with the abuses they commit. And of course, this has nothing to do with disrespecting or not caring about the safety and well-being of Israelis or Saudis for that matter. And again, look at that formulation. Nobody said in response to a tweet about Saudi Arabia, like, oh man, you're really feeding stereotypes about the Saudi monarchy. She's talking about policy issues. She's right on the merits, and the idea, the notion that she would not have a right to say these things because of who she is disgusting, racist, delusional in and of itself, and incredibly prejudiced and paranoid. So we need to have her back 100%. Keep calling your congresspeople. Keep sending your tweets, whatever. Call the Washington Post editorial page. They published such a disgusting and stupid and craven piece, I hesitate to even mention the guy's name. It's so utterly demented. This is Ilhan Omar is the Steve King of the left. And, and one thing I could say is, like, there is literally no Steve King of the left. That doesn't exist by definition. Because even the closest analogs that you can look for and actually find are people that the only reason you're saying that they are on the left is because they're a person of color, as an example. So I actually don't compare Louis Farrakhan to Steve King. I like Louis Farrakhan a hell of a lot more than Steve King, and to compare Steve King to Louis Farrakhan is an insult to Louis Farrakhan. But Louis Farrakhan definitely has said bigoted things objectively. And here's the secret of Louis Farrakhan. He's not on the left. By what metric would a socially conservative religious leader be put on the left? Get real. This piece is so unbelievably disgusting and stupid and poorly argued that it should go up the chain of command just on embarrassment's sake alone.
It seems almost crazy. Because it came out at such an inopportune time for Ilhan that it seems almost coordinated, but it's such a clunker. It's
so stupid and overdone that they've shot themselves with it. Because what the best tack was, you want some plausible deniability when you're trying to do a political assassination. And the other thing I'll say too, and I don't normally do this because, again, I'm actually a good person to say AOC needs to step up on this, because I'm not the person who's always freaking out about this and that. There's politics. People have to make calculations. People have to make plays. She needs to be clear, unequivocal, and no bullshit on this. This is part of her cohort. This is someone that she has framed as a personal friend. And incidentally, even from a very cynical perspective, if you go to the New York Times piece with AIPAC talking about their strategy moving forward, they said, we're getting rid, We think in several years, Ilhan, Rashida Tlaib, and AOC won't be there. So whether you want to or not, whether or not you think that because you've gotten a lot of great press coverage and you can transcend this social democratic liberal dichotomy through your charisma and outreach, which, by the way, again, that's great. To the extent that's possible, go for it. But you also have a home and a commitment, in my view. And part of that home and the commitment has to be having unequivocally having the back of the most brave member of Congress by any objective measure, and someone that you're going to work closely with to do all the things that you talk about, even just in the domestic realm, whether it's healthcare, prescription drug prices, the Green New Deal. This is someone who's your cohort. She's right there with you. Steny Hoyer or Nancy Pelosi will always knife you on the merits, even if they're trying to smooth you now. So even from a very calculated long-term perspective, there needs to be clear, unequivocal support and solidarity now. No bullshit, no prevarication.
Yeah, if Ilhan can do the stand up on her own, you can stand up with them too. You've got
certainly.
a lot more cover than Ilhan does.
You've got an unbelievable amount of political capital, and I think that what some people have been way too fast to jump the gun, and not even just recognize the realities of being a politician. And I'll always defend AOC from a kind of puritanical nonsense. And I like her, and she's doing a really good job, and all the rest of it. But there's going to be certain things that the foundation of your career and where you come from, I think those people are going to take a lot of notice. And I think solidarity with Ilhan Omar is absolutely one of those times.
And Corbyn, frankly.
Corbyn was a terrible signal. And you could have more, again, though, you could have more deniability of like it's a foreign leader, blah, blah, blah. But that was poorly played. You listen to some Twitter idiot. And, again, but this one, Corbyn was poorly played and worth critiquing. This would be profoundly problematic and unacceptable. Do you want to say something?
I mean, if you want to be a transformative politician, you have to be prepared to challenge the politics as they are. And you can't be so quick to look at, a group of people who aren't going to be your friends when it comes to actually supporting the policies that that we really need to have, and to challenge the power base, which is frankly exposing itself right now when it comes after Omar and people who are sort of breaking a traditional Democratic Party line.
100%. And let's be really real about this. There might be a handful of people on generational lines that still think that any criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. And that is wrong and inaccurate, but fair enough. But plenty of other people, again, let's be honest about this. I mean, you got a guy like Haim Sabin who got billions off of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and funds the Democratic Party. He said, Israel's my issue. And some of this is crass elevation of donor base over the type of democratic transformation that you're supposed to be about. And the fact that I even have to think to myself when I say that some asshole is going to say that I'm being, self-hating Jew or something is disgusting. And don't ever come to me with that shit. Ever. Ever. And don't come to Ilhan with it. Don't come to any adult with it. Because it's pathetic and it's an abuse of the term. Of like a very real thing. I mean, these conversations actually make us forget that is a real thing. Like people get murdered to this day because they're that.
I mean, people were murdered in Pittsburgh.
Precisely.
I mean, just recently. And, I just want to say, too, it's like that's so offensive that people have been doing it. And let's also not forget that Ilhan is not just being targeted because of her questions about Israel. She's being targeted because of what she's been doing on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Because she talked about Elliot Abrams.
Exactly.
Because she was clear on Elliot Abrams. Because she won't support a coup in Venezuela.
And what's the number one thing that the Republicans
that's right.
have been saying is that they want her off of that committee. And that's a very big part of it that we should not lose sight of, right? Because there's a conversation, there's a discourse conversation, but there's actually a power conversation that's going on where they're trying to pull her out of a position where she can challenge American imperialism and authority.
Yeah, and if they pull this and don't do this resolution but still pull her from the committees, that's absolutely not.
Absolutely unacceptable. Yeah. Absolutely unacceptable. All right, guys, let's do a little pitch and talk about the LA Live show, and then we'll take a brief break and bring Ben Burgis to logify us. Proposition 1 as to why you should be a TMBS patron. How's that, Ben? No, that was me. So guys, first of all, most of what happens is like people have bad, like their credit cards don't update and everything. That's super frustrating. But we definitely, you could see like people explain in their exit surveys, it's like 99% because of financial circumstances, and I think this is because of tax season would be my guess. Some people, but you need to get us right back up there because we're not going to do the food bucket challenge unless we get back above 2,000, and I know everybody wants to see that. And we need to. So let's try to get to 2,100 by the end of this month. Get us comfortably in position. We're going to be having a new offering that's going to be developing for 21 and above patrons in addition to 2 calls a month. We're going to be doing, working with he's a really very well-regarded editor. We're going to do video versions of illicit histories. And about 1 of every 3 or 1 of every 4 we'll release on the YouTube channel. The others will be for Comrade and above patrons as an exclusive offering. Even on YouTube, thankfully, we've gotten our monetization. Please subscribe and let people know about it. But we were talking about earlier, like, we want to do well on YouTube, but the bottom line is we're going to still put up a lot of content on places like Haiti and Brazil and stuff that should get more clicks, but it doesn't, right? But we're not going to re-engineer our YouTube content. I mean, we'll definitely have, like, Bill Maher videos and this and that, but there's still going to be a ton of content up there that we think is worthy in and of itself, and then also just reflects what this show is about and what you get as a patron. So the foundation of this show is you, and it's people who are really committed to this type of really serious content. This weekend in Illicit History with Tamanisha John on Caribbean debt, the history of it, the why of it, from imperialism to the World Bank and IMF. Also, Nelson Denis and I are recording something on war against all Puerto Ricans. We continue in this vein. Coming up on a future Illicit Histories, Marissa Baradaran is returning, and we're talking about reparations. C. Derek Varn's going to be on soon as well. And, of course, you get the post-game, whole bunch of other additional content. It's time. Patreon.com/TMBS. Patreon.com/TMBS. In LA on April 20th, 420. I said that like Chris Matthews. Matt Leck, it's a 420 show. Hey, Matt, 420. It'd be great if like Chris Matthews could just come in and harass Matt about smoking pot. I don't know why. That's a funny concept to me. Yeah, you're reading novels, you're smoking while you read. I like how it annoys Matt so much, even as an impression.
Oh, I just wouldn't engage.
Yeah, I know you. You'd be like,
why is he here?
All right, Chris, check your sound.
I'm going home. Are we recording something? I'm getting home.
Hopefully soon. My goal is
Chris
if Chris Matthews is ever out at MSNBC, I definitely want him to be.
He can do like
TMBS crew.
He can be like the Bill O'Reilly of the left, just like showing up on other people's shows. That's all Bill O'Reilly does now.
Oh, he doesn't even have his own live stream anymore.
Well, he does, but he's like Bill with this person. And
Bill O'Reilly can't make fun of anybody anymore. Can't pay a private detective to follow my wife anymore. All right. But the TMB, can we get that up on the Bootleg Theater website? April 20th, TMBS second live show. We had a blast at the Bell House. The video version of the Bell House you can watch as a TMBS patron. That's something we released for patrons. The audio version we released on iTunes, so you can go download and listen to it and check out how much fun we had. There's less tickets to this show. So if we get that end of like last couple of weeks surge that we did for the Bell House, the Bell House had enough things that like, I don't remember what the final count was, but we were like just about there with selling it out. But this one, if the same number gets reached, will be sold out relatively quickly in that last surge. So I would get your tickets now. Of course, it's going to be the 3 of us with amazing guests, Anna Kasparian, Big Waz, Wozni Lambre, and Nando Vila, April 20th at the Bootleg Theater. Left is best, West Coast best. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll be right back with Ben Burgis on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. That one? All right. We jumped the gun a little bit, and we had a little technical mishap. What happened was I was going to go to the Economic Minute with David Griscom, and I got a text from Richard Wolff telling me that, who, by the way, it's not totally confirmed yet, but I think he's going to be returning in April for his second appearance. And he just said, if you keep giving that little fuck airtime, I will never set foot in that studio again. Hashtag real Marxism. So I got distracted. And then the camera blew out, which is that Richard Wolff related? That's what's disturbing to me. He's a little tricky. Is that a Jew comment you're making?
Oh Lord!
Ooh.
Is this the game we're going to
Look who's getting Ilhan Omar.
David Griscom's tropes.
Yeah, maybe we should have a little bit of a censure process in the TMBS studio.
Which I'm
that's
very big on, like
hurtful
off
to
camera. That's
people.
all I talk about is censoring people, and I get censored.
That's how it works.
Yeah, why don't we get into this?
Maybe in a second. I want to watch you be uncomfortable for about another 20 more seconds.
Yeah, can I distance myself from Griscom already?
Yeah, I would do that. First of all, let Ben distance himself from you. Then you can do your segment. Ben, is there anything? I know it's been. By the way, it's been an intense week for you on the anti-Semitism front as well. Yes. Everybody's Ilhan Omar all of a sudden. Did that camera get fixed? Okay. All right. Let's go to David Griscom. It's the Economic Minute. Do we have his graphic ready? Or
we're all up.
Are we all ready? All right. All of a sudden, everybody gets the tech together when it's their segment.
Some people shine on camera.
Some people are like, oh, all of a sudden I fucked everything up, but I can't keep track of anything. But I certainly have my graphic ready.
I definitely do.
Go ahead.
So, now that we're sort of breaking into the, early into 2019, we can really start looking at what happened during the year of 2018. And, I have some news that won't surprise too many people. But wage inequality actually increased in 2018 as wage growth was sluggish for the majority of workers. And I just want to remind everyone, since 2007, wage growth has been highest for those in the top 10% of earners. For those at the bottom, not so much, except for one very specific group, workers who lived in areas that saw minimum wage increases. Workers at the bottom 10% of earnings that live in states that increased the minimum wage at least once in the past 5 years had wages that grew at a rate 50% faster than states that did not have minimum wage increases. And these gains become even more significant when you look at the data for women and black workers. Now, it is not enough for just a few states to raise their minimum wage. We need a national minimum wage increase. And the Economic Policy Institute estimates that in the U.S., if we were able to see a national minimum wage increase to just $15 an hour, 12 million workers would enjoy a pay increase. The majority of these workers are people working in industries like construction, manufacturing, education, and healthcare. And, when we fight for minimum wage increases, we're always faced with the same tired arguments from business interest groups, the right wing, and neoliberals. And it always goes something like this. The minimum wage might be well-intentioned and nice, but it actually hurts the very same people that you're trying to help.
Blow me.
Oh, and it's so sad, and it's nice that these these neoliberals and right wingers seem to care so much about the poor when it comes to paying them more.
That's a common right wing theme.
Oh,
which
certainly.
is a complete lack of concern for the well-being of poor people until it involves a proposal to help them.
Exactly, and
Right.
this tired refrain that we get from supply side quackery is proven wrong time and time again, because in theory and in practice, a minimum wage increase helps the very same people who receive more money. So Seattle just highlighted this. Now, initially when Seattle raised their minimum wage, we saw studies that were coming out that were saying, oh my God, what's going on in Seattle is an absolute disaster, including a study from the University of Washington that was cited in the New York Times by right-wing think tanks and by a lot of other kind of centrist publications saying, like, look what happens when we raise the minimum wage too quickly. But last October, the very same researchers retracted those findings, instead arguing that, in fact, paying workers more is in their benefit. Now, some workers
This is like the road job. I just have to say, there was work that came out of Harvard, I think, in 2009. It was Kenneth Rogoff and one of the researcher.
Reinhardt and Rogoff.
Yeah, Reinhardt and Rogoff. And they were that was a close call. They were their paper was the main citation of why we needed austerity instead of stimulus. And then it was wrong.
There's a sound effect for that. You want to hear it?
Yes.
Yeah, let's get it. No, but it's one of these things.
It was debunked by a graduate student at UMass.
Well,
it was literally
there was just a
Excel
error.
It was literally an Excel error.
In those kind of studies, usually just rely on so many assumptions. As in a lot of ways, what happened actually more in practice, what happened in Seattle. So a lot of business owners, businesses that were already failing, shuttered their doors and said, "Oh, we have to shut down because of these minimum wage increases." But in fact, you look out, these people were just massively in debt and they needed to close down their business in the first place. So what you saw initially was
couldn't cut it in the market.
What you see is initially is that while the only major negative effect is that some workers found that they were working less hours, and we're talking maybe like 4 or 5 hours less a week, but because their wage was so much higher, they were actually making the same, if not more, as they were before the minimum wage increase. So I don't know, working less, making the same or more money is pretty good in my book. So the fear-mongering that we heard from closing down restaurants, it was not caused by the wage, but from following through on threats, poor management, and learned behavior. As a whole, the minimum wage has been a boon for workers wherever it is enacted. And this is just really important to say because we have seen since the 70s a complete decoupling of of a line between wage increases and productivity increases. We've seen productivity increase in this country, but wages have not. They've remained stagnant. So what we're seeing more and more is it's harder for workers to be able to be paid a fair share. So what we need to do...
in Marxist terms, that means that the rate of theft...
The rate of exploitation is much higher.
exploitation is higher, and the concealed relationship from wages is more and more threadbare.
Exactly. But this is really important because we have to understand that in a situation where we do have a working class that does not have the same rates of unionization, and especially when we're talking about jobs where people are only staying for a year, 2, 3 years, and they're not able to sort of fight for the benefits that they might need in that job, we need more and more for the government to come in and act on behalf of all workers as a whole. So that's why these movements that we've been seeing of uniting working class people across the board to fight together for wage increases has been very successful in improving the living standards of working people, and it's something that's very important. Simply put, paying people more is a good thing, and we should be doing a lot more of that in this country.
I just want to pick you up on one thing. You said the people that were given more money, those were the people that benefited?
Yeah.
Hold on, you gotta have to slow down here.
Yeah, whoa.
Seems a bit heavy on the theory.
Yeah.
It's tough. Especially, I mean, people who are working less and making more money, that's actually a good thing, too.
That's a good thing for those people?
Wow.
Yeah, it's... Actually,
let me just introduce you, then jump right in. By the way, is his mic, is everything
He's
good?
all ready to go.
Okay. Ben Burgis, author of the forthcoming book from Zero Books, my publisher, of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. I was trying to do a Bill Maher, my old job. Yeah. That is my favorite joke. I love the way Bill Maher introduces guests by saying, my old job. It's super awesome.
Yeah.
He's also teaches logic and a variety of other courses in philosophy at universities across the country, currently now at Rutgers. Ben, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah,
What were you going to say?
absolutely.
I'm sorry, I interrupted your flow. What were you
Oh,
gonna say?
no, I was just going to say that at the risk of sounding like your imitation of me before we went to break, Proposition 1, I actually think this minimum wage thing is a good illustration of why it's useful for leftists to get in the habit of actually breaking down these right-wing arguments and looking at how they're supposed to fit together.
Okay, break it down.
Because...
Break it down, Ben. See?
When people make this argument, this obvious, and of course it's bad faith, it's ridiculous that helping the minimum wage will really hurt those who it's meant to help. There's one of the premises, the one that people do usually push back on, is that minimum wage increase unemployment. Now, there's abundant evidence that at this point that's bullshit, you could look at this point, there are decades of studies and meta-studies showing that there's minimal, if any, effect from minimum wage increases on the employment rate. But the thing that always really bugs me about it is that people end up just engaging with that premise, and they're ignoring the other premise, which is implied, which is if there's any increase in unemployment at all, this means it's like a net loss for the working poor. And that's also bullshit. And if you're actually thinking about it and breaking it down, okay, why is this factoid about the supposed employment effect supposed to show that the minimum wage is a bad idea? Then it only follows if you have this premise that, okay, if there's any kind of low rate of employment as a result of the minimum wage, that means that it's overall bad for those who it's meant to help. But we shouldn't be quick to accept that either, because even if, for the sake of argument, there was some low rate of employment, which there's not, Most people who advocate minimum wage increases also advocate all sorts of social democratic programs that would help those who were temporarily out of a job. And two, there's a lot of research showing that minimum wage increases have all kinds of other positive effects. There's actually a major European study. I don't know off the top of my head. I could certainly look it up and tweet it out later, showing that literally, and this is based on data from a bunch of different countries, for every dollar increase in minimum wage, there's an increase in the life expectancy of the working poor.
So that would be another negative from a conservative perspective.
Yeah, no, that's right. But it's good to draw
honestly,
that
I'm
out.
being flippant, but I think this is always my question for you. And obviously, I've already answered it, or I wouldn't want to be doing so much content with you. But it's like, re-anchor why this matters, because I think on some level, what I think part of the reason that the left has this like allergy to all of this like wankery that we hear when most people, unfortunately, these brands of these words have been toxified because we associate them with a bunch of disingenuous twerps who are trying to harm the world. And there's been a sort of twofold answer, which in some ways has been healthy, which is like, one, and I think, I agree with you about like moralism and moralistic responses. I'm very allergic to them. And then on the other hand, though, it's like, I think of someone like Carol Gilligan at Harvard has influenced me a lot. And she talked about how basically like from a developmental psychology perspective, you go from like self-care, community care, and then world care. And those are increasing moral modes of operation. Like the maturation of a human being involves including more people in your sphere of concern to the extent that that's possible. So some of these arguments to me do break down on these really clear lines. Like sometimes it's like, well, like the thing with like a Paul Ryan budget, he's lying about what the budget does, which is the problem. But actually what he wants to do or wanted to do policy-wise, it was a great policy for, because he wants to squeeze the margins. He wants to, cut the safety net, and he wants to create an even more subservient, pliant workforce and redistribute more money to the top. And I don't.
Right.
So we have a fundamental moral conflict. And then the other part of it, I think, was actually getting, I'll just put this on the table too, and then you can debunk all of it. I was in a conversation once, and I won't say which because I'm friendly with the guy who I did this podcast with, and if people really want to dig it up, they can, but I won't say with who. But if you want to dig it up, you can. And, I was talking about how, like, basically just basic stuff, politics about power, right? And he got offended. Like, he actually was upset by this notion that politics wasn't about persuasion. And I just said, I bought, one of the most innocuous, obvious examples, like, hey, well, we ended up sweatshop labor in the United States, and no small, of course it's complex and blah, blah, blah. But a major part of it was because there were labor unions that were just like, no, and they did work stoppages. And he literally was like, well, no, they had to go to the bosses and convince them that it was morally wrong. I had the same reaction. I had to restrain myself, but it was just like, this is ludicrous. This is nonsense. But those have been the primary modes, I think, of argument that we've actually been exposed to in the mainstream, which is that politics isn't a conflict. It's an endless kind of wank fest.
Yeah.
Or you have to pretend that you share goals with your opponents when you don't. And I think that that's partially, in addition to the fact also that, Ben Shapiro and all these other cretins are using this terminology, is where some of the allergy to this logic and all of this comes from. So break it down. Like, what are the answers to those concerns, and why do we really need to get back in the mix with proper argumentation?
Sure. So I think that the easiest part of that is that it's absolutely true that Paul Ryan is arguing in bad faith, that you're not going to convince him, because even if you convinced him on the facts, his real answer would be, yeah, good, that's what I want, right?
Right.
I think that's absolutely true. But of course, we're not trying to convince Paul Ryan.
Right.
Right. So I think that one reason that I think we should care about resisting these right-wing arguments and actually breaking them down and showing what's wrong with them is because there are winnable people who might get fooled by those arguments. And I think that that one way to think about this is what you're talking about. Okay, we have certain goals. We care about certain things. We've got, you're talking about Carol Gilligan, who I, by the way, heard a lot about when I was in grad school in my PhD program at the University of Miami, because Michael Sloat teaches there. And he's like one of the leading advocates of this care ethics approach. That's
care ethics. Right?
Yeah, Yep, that's right. That's inspired by Gilligan.
Yeah. She's a legend, man.
So and in fact, but to stay on Sloat, I mean, one of his big influences, who I talk about in the book, as you know, is David Hume, who talks about the gap between facts and values. And this is actually a funny thing, because you're right. One of the sources of left-wing allergy to logic talk is that there's this certain kind of centrist or person who wants to portray all of logic, all of politics as a debating society. That that it's all about persuasion. That if you just make a good enough argument, then bitter political enemies will accept what you're saying. If you make a good enough argument against child labor, the bosses will stop child labor. I'm fairly sure, side note, that if we had to rely on that to end child labor, there would be child labor going on in Amazon warehouses right now.
Right now.
Jeff Bezos would absolutely be unswayed by your moral argument. But this is actually a funny thing, because it's an actual law of logic that you can't derive a should conclusion, a moral or political conclusion, from purely factual premises. That's called Hume's law, that you can't get to, this is what we should do, from premises that are just about facts, which is something that the intellectual dark web types, are, constantly run roughshod over this.
Yeah, so I actually want to. So actually, then let's go to Sam Harris for a second.
Yeah,
we have the
absolutely.
Clips, but I mean, this is something that he does all the time. Of literally that facts can disclose ethics to us.
Yes.
And then that he's and insofar as I can read it, I mean, it sounds like some restating of a utilitarian argument to me. That's the best I can tell. But somehow that objective statements about the world can yield moral truths. And then it always seems to either get into incredibly dangerous moral confusion, because then you can start doing things like there's no meaningful difference. But if everything was just about minimizing loss of human life, we'd have speed limits at 10 miles an hour. Ergo, we can have drone strikes without any oversight, right? As an example, I'm thinking, I don't know if that's a Harris example. It sounds like one, but I'm not sure.
Certainly sounds like one.
It sounds very Harrisy. I'm not sure it is though. So please, not taking him out of context. Calm down, breathe.
Let's not smear Harris as having that position. I mean, sure, he's openly speculated about, hey, maybe we should nuke the Middle East.
Right. No. Yeah. But of course. But I mean, that was really to not. And anyways, that's a whole exhausting thing, and that's a whole other problem with him. But it seems like what happens when you do that in his case, when you don't make this firm distinction, is you fall into either that type of really dangerous moral confusion, or the nuke or the thought experiments and all of that, or you actually end up just going to what your instincts are, and then you just are making subjective commentaries that you're trying to smuggle through objective realities. We can all agree. And even things that I would tend to agree with, right? Yes, we can all agree that everybody can have, everybody needs to have health care, but I'm aware that I'm making a moral claim. I'm not saying something that's just sort of scientifically self-evident. I'm aware that comes from a foundation in my own politics. And that's a distinct starting point versus just saying this has somehow just been revealed to me through science.
Yeah, absolutely. So Harris claims that the way you can derive values from science is that, first he starts out by saying that the morally good is that which has good consequences, essentially. And the argument that he gives from that is that, imagine that everybody was in horrible pain all the time, right? We were all in hell. Well, that would be bad, right? Okay, right. Fair enough. Therefore, the more we move away from that, the better it is, and science can tell us things about how we can move away from it. But if you actually slow down that argument, at a crucial point, he's just appealing to a straight moral intuition.
Right.
So, and this is Hume's point, that the facts can tell us things about how to achieve our goals, that, understanding factual premises can tell us, okay, this is going to be an effective strategy. This isn't going to be an effective strategy because we've tried it out. But it can't tell us which goals to care about in the first place. And the people who talk most about logic obscure this point, but this is actually, if you're actually interested not just in sort of wielding the rhetoric of logic as a way of sounding impressive, but you're interested in reasoning well, this is a principle of good reasoning. You can't derive an ought from an is. And one of the things that Harris would say is, no, you totally can, because we all think that like medicine is part of science, but what about what we view as healthy and what we don't view as healthy? Somebody could say, isn't it arbitrary that you value living a long life and all of this stuff, and I could have some other conception of health, which what I would say to that is, well, actually, yes, statements about health are statements about what we consider to be a good life.
Right.
Homosexuality used to be in the DSM. Right. The fact that it's not anymore is not primarily a result of empirical developments. It's a result of a successful struggle to get people to have a different value judgment that that as a result of the gay liberation movement.
Right.
Or for that matter, what the IDW types are all up in arms about this week. One of their big causes is the American Psychological Association's guidelines about boys and men, toxic masculinity and all that, right? So, which is kind of a stupid argument, like it's mostly a tempest in a teapot. But once again, they're objecting that, that what the APA values as far as what they think a healthy life is, isn't what we do. And so again, that's not an argument about facts. That's an argument about values.
So essentially what and so this is actually the whole big postmodern smuggle. Because what they've done, it seems to me, and particularly from reading you, is they try to make, like, they take a caricature, which maybe some French theorists fall into.
Sure.
I've read some dumb postmodernism in my day, of, like, ultimate relativism, right? Like, hey, your explanation of how a jet engine works, like, if you want to say it's because there's secretly, like, a genie operating it, or you want to explain the aerodynamics of it, it's equally valid because it's all literary narrative. Like, all right, sure, whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe I've read a few things like that in college.
Sure.
Fair enough. But then they're actually taking that one objection to a very extreme and marginal even within the field view. And then they're saying, then there's this whole massive middle gulf in between that caricature and then basically like, well, 3 + 3 = 6. And then pretty much once you're out of that, you're in the terrain of history.
Yeah.
Like even when we talk about science, like or evolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's interesting that there's objective facts. Like, of course, we know the Earth isn't 5,000 years old, and we know that there's an evolutionary process, and we evolved from primates and so on. There's no dispute about that. But there's massive dispute about, like, well, are we a cooperative species or a violent species? Or are we and everybody can find evidence to support all of these different narratives. And it's like, well, that's politics. That's history. That's showing that even in the most objective realms of science, there's a lot of mess here.
Yeah. So,
and the DSM is a great example. That's a political document. That's not a scientific.
Yeah, absolutely. That again, what we consider healthy reflects a certain conception of what a good life is.
Right.
And we could, and it's good to know that so we know what we're having an argument about. And so you brought up a really interesting example about how there's a lot of mixed empirical evidence about how violent we are as a species, how cooperative we are as a species. But I think somewhat parallel to the minimum wage point, I think that this is where, again, I think it is actually a valuable exercise to break down exactly what people's arguments seem to be.
Okay.
Because a lot of times I see my fellow leftists, socialists, accepting the way that the right frames this argument in a way that I think is a mistake. So in other words, they'll sort of accept the premise that if human beings are, to a great extent or beyond a certain threshold, violent or selfish or anything like that, that means that we can't have socialism. That means that we should just accept the sort of brutal hierarchies that we have right now. But it's not obvious why that means that we should accept that. And in fact, I think that there's a powerful argument to be made in the other direction. That, look, of course, as you say, there's evidence on both sides. It's a very murky empirical.
Well, I'm a super into it gives as much as it takes. So I wouldn't rest your argument. Like, people are like, we're fucking apes and we fucking are killing each other and it's fucking capitalism, and other people are like, nah, like bonobos, like suck each other's dicks and it's awesome. It's like, I would chill on all those arguments because you don't know what the fuck is going to get revealed about some. And frankly, I am fascinated by that, but I don't really care so much about ape behavior relative to what we have to do to get our politics sorted.
So, well,
frankly, but anyways, you have a better argument than me.
Well, no,
my condescending dismissal.
I mean, I think
which
that,
is still pretty cool.
Well,
because I deliver it well.
Sure.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not against I'm not against condescending dismissals.
I know.
Which I think at this point we know each other well enough
Yeah,
that
yeah,
you know that pretty well.
I know. But you were saying, okay, so accepting the premise that we're violent and hierarchical, what's the socialist answer?
Yeah. All right. So let's accept the premise. And look, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Most likely it's true to a certain extent, right? We have hippie bonobos and gangster chimps,
right.
Within us, right? We contain multitudes. But to the extent that that premise is true, I don't think that's a reason that we should accept capitalist hierarchies. I think that's a reason that we should be working to get rid of capitalist hierarchies, because to the extent that you think that one human being given enough power over another human being is going to treat them like Amy Klobuchar or Harvey Weinstein, then that gives us a reason to have less hierarchical forms of social organization. If we all have at least approximately equal power, then we at least have mutually assured destruction. Nobody's in a position to have the level of control over somebody's life that Amy Klobuchar has over this poor staffer who she makes call into the meeting to say the reason Amy is late to the meeting is that I'm stupid and I'm bad at my job.
Right.
That nobody is in a position that they just have to accept that kind of humiliation. So, if you think that one person given enough power over another person is going to treat them like an insect in a jar, and I'm not necessarily that pessimistic, but to the extent that you do treat that kind of deep pessimism about human nature seriously, that this is all Stanford prison experiments,
right? Which has been debunked.
By
the way, that one has been debunked pretty thoroughly. The Stanford prison experiment has been. I mean, as much as I wouldn't rest an argument on either version, I do think, especially when you're talking to the right, it's like, no, there's really not proof that we're such assholes. It's not like a completely benign interpretation at all either.
Sure.
But guys, we're actually not.
Right.
We're not necessarily. But that's a great argument. If you really accept that premise, then man, do you need to flatten out as many disparities as possible, because we can't be trusted with them.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's exactly. So we're going to start with this bet. We have a couple. We're going to run a Burgis clinic here, and there's going to be a couple clips we'll do in the post game. But this was crazy though, because a couple of weeks ago I was on vacation. And we were in Puerto Rico, but
I was sending you text messages about this, and you were like, "Hey, I'm lying on a beach in Puerto Rico. I don't have time for this."
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was like, dude, drink some rum, relax. It's okay. It was just like, but you did a video, for Zero Books. And you've done a whole series. Everybody should go over and subscribe. Zero Books is great in general, and you can watch this whole series. Doug does amazing work over there. But you did this video on basically Ben Shapiro's just his logical inconsistencies with arguments with regards to Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened?
Yeah.
Did they engage you? Did Ben Shapiro and or his followers engage you in an open exchange of
ideas? Yeah, so of course that's what you would expect to happen, that all of the Ben Shapiro fans would show up in the comments and they would make, reasoned, calm arguments. And
as you can see, Ben shows up, he's wearing a keffiyeh, he goes C to C, and hola, hola, he's all about it.
Yeah, Well, I'm going to really shock anybody who's watching this on YouTube and say that I am in fact part Jewish, but that's
I'm really I'm legitimately tired of that. Like, no one can indulge in anti-Semitism, right? Unless you're being funny, but like no one can indulge in like actual anti-Semitism. But I'm done. Like, I don't believe in standpoint epistemology. There's certain issues where everybody can talk about them. It's like if you're not Jewish, you shouldn't comment about, I don't know, like how a particular temple is run.
Right.
But you have the fucking right to talk about a sovereign nation state.
You do.
I am done with that shit, man. It's ridiculous. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, by the way, is going to come up in the clip because just as a little preview, the first thing Ben Shapiro is going to say in this clip is as a Jew, right? So you should trust him about what is and isn't anti-Semitism. You should defer to him because he's a member of this traditionally oppressed group.
Just like he does when black people talk about racism.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah,
this is...
Right. Yeah. He does that nice defer there.
Yeah, this is a guy who, like, half of his grift is rolling his eyes when anybody says this about any other group. That,
exactly.
If black people, if Native Americans, if gay people, if anybody says, oh, wait a second, this is really bigoted, and this, I'm saying this because of my experiences as a blank, Ben Shapiro will be the first to tell you, as a blank, right, doesn't matter. That, that just do you have a good argument? Do you not? Right? But here he is resting on, as a Jew, I can tell you that that this is anti-Semitism. And of course, some people on the left are just as hypocritical about it because they're far too willing to do the epistemic deference game in other cases, but they rightly resist it in this case. But I think the right way to resolve the inconsistency is let's move away from that across the board, right? That, whether or not you're Jewish should have nothing to do with whether or not you're right when you make a point about Palestinian human rights, just like whether or not you're an Arab or a Muslim should have nothing to do with anything when you're talking about Saudi human rights abuses.
Right.
So the response of some Ben Shapiro fan within a couple hours of this video going up was to file a complaint to YouTube that this was hate speech. And they flagged it. They set it so they disabled comments. They disabled sharing. You couldn't even watch it without clicking through I understand that this might be offensive.
Let me just say that TMBS is strongly supportive of the safety and well-being of the state of Israel. And I've been thinking long and hard about this as a Jew. And don't flag this video.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Well,
I apologize on behalf of Ben.
All right. Fair enough.
Yeah. This is an issue that is very sensitive to me.
Can I get a little solidarity from Griscom?
I'm not touching.
Come on, Griscom. This is Griscom doing McConaughey for Palestinians.
So, so what you should, so when this happened, now YouTube does allow you one appeal.
Right.
And so Doug, our editor at Zero Books, who runs the YouTube channel, and he edits the videos. So he submitted the little paragraph they let you submit for your appeal. And my assumption at the time was, okay, this is incredibly annoying, but as soon as any actual human being works for YouTube, watches this video, all of these restrictions are going to be lifted, because of course they are, because this is ridiculously anodyne, right? There's nothing that I say in that video that 100 left-wing podcasts that I listen to haven't said about these same issues.
Or frankly, even Fareed Zakaria or David Rothkopf. This was a very chill, very...
Yeah, I mean, so in the video...
I watched about 3 minutes of it because we were, in Puerto Rico. But
yeah, sure.
I
there was the...
Yeah.
So in the video, I'm making flame-throwing points hey, Ben Shapiro says that if you cared about Judaism or Israel, you would vote Republican, But what about all of the, the Jewish leftists, over the years who draw from the Jewish religious tradition, like Abraham Joshua Heschel or Michael Lerner or people like this?
Flag it.
And so it's like, okay, nobody could possibly actually watch this video and continue to believe that it's hate speech. Which is why I was really surprised the next morning when they said they'd reviewed the one appeal and they'd upheld the original decision. What could have possibly happened here? And then, of course, I realized that probably what it was is that now we don't know. This is all speculation, which is a big part of the problem. That that there's no transparency whatsoever here. There's you could only guess. It's like when TMBS was trying to get monetized and there was that whole thing going on. You could only guess what's going on the other end of the curtain, which, by the way, I think is a big problem, and I think that this is something that should cause a lot of people on the left to think harder about how flippant that some of us have been when we see right-wing charlatans, like Alex Jones, who's a deeply horrible person, get kicked off all these tech platforms. And you could even make a case that was the right result because of his harassment of the Sandy Hook parents, because he's selling all kinds of pseudo-medical gobbledygook. But it should be disturbing that an incredibly popular commentator could just get kicked off with no clear, no clearly stated rationale, no meaningful due process. Of course. Given that these are platforms that we all rely, in practice, YouTube has a lot more control than the government does over the flow of information. And I think it's a real mistake for leftists to buy into this legalistic libertarian definition of free speech that, if it's a corporation doing it, not the government, don't worry about it, right? There's nothing to see here. In fact, I think our response should be that we should advocate nationalizing these big tech platforms so that we can have due process and meaningful free speech protections. But of course, realistically, I'm sure what happened was that there's some overworked, underpaid YouTube employee who was tasked that morning with looking at 20 videos that had been flagged.
And is told, don't rock the boat.
Exactly.
This is not about editorial analysis. This is causing as little stress for us as possible.
Exactly.
That's the point.
They want to cause relatively few ripples.
Right.
And so they see it's this, and whatever. I mean, it's Zero Books does okay. I've done videos for them that have gotten tens of thousands of views, but it's a relatively small YouTube channel. So it's a relatively small YouTube channel. They see the words Israel, Jews, in the title. And then says okay, whatever, upheld, right?
Yeah,
it's probably
don't use those words.
That's
definitely
which is the takeaway. But there's something really disturbing about that. I remember thinking that because I was on the phone with you after all this happened. You were like, oh yeah, no, you gotta you can't use those titles. You have to, you were talking about.
You're revealing my strategic analysis behind the scenes. I like it.
Yeah.
Talk about how I operate, Ben.
Yeah. So gonna continue to throw Michael under the bus here.
What did I say? No, this makes me sound. I think it makes sense.
No. I mean, it was good rational advice. You said, hey, we just did a video on the one-state solution. We called it Democracy in the Middle East. And it's okay, fair enough, because the reality being the way it is, and the way that YouTube handles these things, that is probably good advice. But there's something a little bit disturbing about the fact that this is we're having this conversation, we're trying to get this past the censorship office of the authoritarian regime. It's oh, no. You can criticize the general secretary, but you can't use his name or else they'll know that you're criticizing him, right? So what you have to say is certain comrades have said,
And they really have. Speaking of which, we have a Ben Shapiro clip and again, you're just going to do two of these clips and it's just going to be, if we stipulate that it's aesthetically, morally repugnant, and that we have different moral starting points, you're going to show us how to argue it out. So we'll start. This is Ben Shapiro talking about Israel and identity, ironically.
So Ilhan Omar tweeted out, quote, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," with a little music symbol. Now, as a Jew, One of the oft-used anti-Semitic tropes, I mean, this has been true for thousands of years, is that the Jews control the monetary systems with their shekels, that the Jews are an evil, nefarious force behind world events spreading around money, and that the reason that people support the Jews is because they've been corrupted by the Jew gold. It's been the Jew gold behind Republican support for the state of Israel.
Pause.
Which
the way Ben Shapiro says Jew gold is very triggering to me, and I want to flag that video for unintentional anti-Semitism, but go ahead.
Which, of course, is a complete lie. The vast majority of Americans support Israel and support Jews because they're not anti-Semitic and because they recognize that Israel is fighting against some of the worst people on planet Earth. And it isn't really a hard choice when you have a choice between democratic country that respects individual rights and evil Islamist dictatorship that tries to murder civilians in their bed.
Okay, Ben, logical analysis. Go.
All right. So, of course, you shouldn't let that go by without correcting his bizarre characterization of Israel-Palestine. That you talk, when you say, oh, there's this democratic state that respects equal rights and everything. Well, hold on, right? That's certainly not true for Palestinian residents of the West Bank, settlers who live in the same areas can vote in Israeli elections. They certainly can't. They're denied basic legal, moral, and human rights in all sorts of ways. And even Palestinians on the other end of the Green Line who are Israeli citizens have been openly discriminated against institutionally. Not even in a, we might talk about structural racism or things being objectively unequal, but in a de jure institutional way since the foundation of the State of Israel, that this is literally a country that makes its citizens have ID cards that say what their ethnic group is on it. Right? So that's just bizarre. But on a logical level, one thing to notice here, and this is worth noting about this video, but also that this is kind of Ben Shapiro's trademark, is that he's using what's called the false dilemma fallacy, which...
Ooh, can I have my board, please? Wow. Wait, what was that again?
It's the false dilemma fallacy, which...
Did you get the Perry Mason? It's very quiet. We need it high. Oh, that's as high as it goes? The false dilemma fallacy.
Nice.
Fanfare. All right, go ahead.
So the false dilemma fallacy saying, hey, there are only two options, so if you don't support this one, you have to support the other one. Right. And the reason
the right uses this like all the time.
Oh, yeah.
This is their bread and butter of argument right here.
Oh, absolutely. And Shapiro in particular uses it all the time. Like, if he stopped using this, he'd more or less have to stop talking. And this is, I think, a particularly blatant example, but Shapiro, because he's loud and he talks fast and he sounds really confident, which is all that the people who respond to his videos, that they love all these videos. Ben Shapiro destroys liberal snowflake. That's all they're responding to, really. That he's saying things they like, he's talking fast, and he sounds confident. But this is such a blatant example of this logical fallacy, this mistaken reasoning, because he said, here are your choices. You could support the Israeli state and what it does to the Palestinians. That's one choice. Or you could support Hamas.
Right.
That's it. Those are the only options.
Right.
So not only does that erase the sort of position that I'd have or you'd have that, that we should, the ideal solution would actually be a one singular secular democratic state with equal rights for everybody and full religious and cultural rights, for all groups. But that's neither supporting Netanyahu nor supporting Hamas. But
ideally, both Hamas and Netanyahu would lose very soundly in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I think that's probably a safe bet that if you had to rely on the votes of millions of Israeli Jews to win a national election, Hamas would not win. Right. And if you had to rely on the votes of
Likud is done.
These increased millions of Arabs, Likud is certainly done.
Right.
But look, even forget that position for a second. I think that's the correct position. But even if you have the sort of liberal Zionist position that says that, okay, Israel should continue to be defined specifically as a Jewish state, and we should make sure it has a Jewish majority forever, but the occupation is bad, and maybe the U.S. should still be pressuring Israel to make certain concessions for the sake of a two-state solution, which, by the way, what I've just described is the majority position among Americans and the majority position among American Jews.
Right.
Which is something that gets left out a lot of this conversation about Ilhan Omar and anti-Semitism, that most American Jews are closer to Ilhan Omar's actual position than they are to the AIPAC Ben Shapiro position.
Definitely.
The polling is very clear on this, that most Americans, and look, American Jews have the same positions on this in polls as Americans in general do. There's no particular daylight there, and most of them do think that the U.S. should have a more neutral role in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But instead of arguing against that, because Shapiro doesn't have a good argument against it, and on some level he knows that, he's just excluding it in advance from consideration. That
Right.
That we're not gonna, he's not gonna have an argument against that sort of cosmopolitan secular one-state solution. He's not even gonna make an argument against a liberal Zionist two-state solution. He's just going to exclude those in advance. So either you agree with him that the Palestinians should continue to be brutalized and humiliated in the way they are, or you agree with Hamas. Those are the only options. And I think once you realize that that's what he's saying, then I think it even a lot of people who might be swayed by this argument, right? And don't get me wrong, I am under no illusion whatsoever that the most hardcore Ben Shapiro fans are going to be convinced by anything that some nerdy little college, Marxist college professor like me says ever, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not the point. But the point is this: that when the only ways that we have to respond to these bad right-wing arguments are either mockery, which I've already indicated I'm not entirely opposed to. I think it has, there's a very legitimate role that it has, or moral condemnation, which I'm also not opposed to. I think that these, like Ben Shapiro, actually is an objectively horrible person who's making the world a worse place, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. But when our only responses are mockery or moral condemnation, when those are the only weapons in our arsenal, then that's bad, both because of those winnable people that we talked about earlier, that anybody who is sitting on the fence will eventually get the impression that you don't actually have a response to the argument,
Right.
and that's a very bad look. And even just on a shaved ape dominance game level, that's a very bad move. That's a very weak move. And two, when we move from arguments with the dregs of humanity like Ben Shapiro to arguments among good people about how to achieve our shared goals, if we get ourselves used to only relying on mockery and moral condemnation, then inevitably those are the tools that we're going to turn on each other, which I've got to say, every time I log into Twitter, I see a lot of evidence of that in terms of how intra-left debates are conducted.
Super toxic and unhelpful. Yeah. All right, let's do one more. This is Jesus Christ. We're going to need a serious palate cleanser in the post game. Jordan Peterson.
There's this professor, I think his name is Wolf. He put a challenge up on YouTube to me a couple of weeks ago to debate him. And what did he say? He said, he criticized my criticism of Marx. He said, well, that Peterson, he's basically stuck in 1989. It's like, we've progressed way past the time of the Stalinists. It's like, and I thought, well, how about if a Nazi said that, just out of curiosity? It's like, well, it's not 1945, anymore. It's like us National Socialists, we've progressed way past what happened in Nazi Germany. It's like we should just, don't be stuck in the past, right? It's time to give us another chance. It's like, well, how about no? How about, well, we have the Soviet Union with the 20 million dead there, and we have Mao's China with God only knows how many people were killed there, and we have Cambodia, we have Vietnam, and Venezuela isn't looking that great, by the way, and Cuba can't feed itself, and that's just a smattering of Marxist catastrophes. It's like, well, how much evidence do you need?
Yeah.
I want to go to mockery really badly, Ben, so please go.
Okay.
Because you got to restrain me, man.
All right.
Because I can't process this without mockery.
Well, I will say that I find it pretty amazing that if you think about the Venn diagram between Jordan Peterson fans and like MRA types who think that masculinity is under attack, etc., that's pretty much a circle, right?
Right.
So it confuses me that people who are really into traditional masculinity respond to this guy. I'm just going to say that.
Can I have my board, please? That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I remember back in the day when the models of toxic masculinity weren't hysterics. But anyways,
yeah, this strange, weepy, high pitched,
speaking my language now, brother.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think, and look, this is a language that I always speak at a friend from grad school who lives here in Brooklyn now, who used to say that the Burgis specialty was showing you what's wrong with your argument, then making you feel bad about having said it in the first place.
Oh, nice.
But I think
what is
we
wrong
should
with
talk
that
about
argument?
what's wrong with his
All
argument.
right, so go ahead.
Right? Okay, so so he's doing a couple things here. First of all, he's got this absurd analogy between the Nazi case and Marxism. And so somebody like me, as he knows, and he's trying to preempt this move, is going to say, well, hold on. It's true, of course, that the Stalinist regimes did commit horrible atrocities. Nobody's denying that, or, maybe three people selling a newspaper on the street and screaming at you about Baba-Vakian are denying it. But, essentially nobody denies that. But I would point to there's this long, rich tradition of anti-Stalinist Marxism that, in fact, people from Rosa Luxemburg, in 1918, straight through the fall of that system, were making these left-wing socialist criticisms of that system and pointing out the profound disconnect between what was advocated by thinkers like Marx and Engels and what happened in the Soviet Union. And Peterson is trying to preempt that by saying, oh, whatever, like what if a Nazi said that? And of course, the correct answer is, okay, what if a Nazi did say that? If a Nazi said that, I would ask them what they were talking about, because there is, of course, no long, rich tradition of Nazi theory that we can contrast Nazi practice to.
Right.
There is no such thing as Nazi theory. People who are attracted to fascism are attracted to violence and power. They're not really attracted to theory. There is no 19th century Nazi theorists who the 20th century Nazis were putting into practice or not putting into practice. So that's all right. If you want to be nerdy about this, this is the weak analogy fallacy. But more than that, what he's doing here is a deep equivocation. So he's saying, hey, Richard Wolff is a Marxist, and despite the fact that I'm willing to get profiled in this Barry Weiss thing in the New York Times as this bold intellectual rebel who's not afraid of taboos, and, I'm a renegade, I'm willing to just see, follow any idea wherever it leads.
Fucking do it. It's like, whatever.
Yeah. Which, of course, if you took that posture seriously, you'd think, oh, he'd love to debate Richard Wolff, right? That this says, that he rejects these kinds of progressive, egalitarian, Marxist, economic ideas. He thinks that's really misguided, so he would want to just have at it with a high-profile intellectual representative of that tradition who knows what he's talking about. That's what you would expect. But instead of that, he's going to say, no. we should just exclude this. We should essentially cancel Marxists because of these atrocities committed by the Stalinist regime. So the implied argument that he's making here is that the Stalinist regimes were Marxist. They committed all these atrocities. Therefore, Marxists are evil people who should be associated with atrocities, and that should be outside of the realm of debate and discussion. But of course, Marxists means something different in the premise and the conclusion. Gonna do it one more time. This is the fallacy of equivocation.
Say, baby, put down that pipe and get my pipe up.
I really need to have you in class with me at Rutgers so you can do these sound effects during lectures.
Absolutely.
So it's a fallacy of equivocation where you use the same term, the same word or phrase in two different parts of the argument, but you're using it to mean two different things. So you're talking about Marxism or socialism, and on the one hand, you're talking about Richard Wolff, who is clearly not an advocate of the Soviet model.
And I mean, it's also like you are in fact smearing him, because I don't know in the specific, I know in the Wolff video I think he's referencing, Richard Wolff did say, wow, you have a completely sort of embarrassing lack of knowledge about something you're pontificating on. But you could take like 2 seconds of research, I mean like literally, or under 30 seconds to find that Richard Wolff's interested in Mondragon and all of these worker cooperative models. So you're doing everything you're saying. You're also leveling this like incredible sort of personal misrepresentation of somebody that's like incredibly, at best, intellectually lazy, at worst, intellectually dishonest.
Oh yeah. Here's how little research you would have to do to realize that Richard Wolff is an advocate in the Soviet model. Here's what you'd have to do. You don't have to watch any YouTube videos. You don't have to read any of his books. You don't even have to read any magazine articles that he's written. All you have to do is read the title of his book. The title of his book is Democracy at Work, The Cure for Capitalism, which right away tells you that he's not advocating a top-down bureaucratic command and control economy. He's advocating what Marx meant by socialism, which was collective democratic workers' control of the means of production. So you're saying socialism in the sense of the Soviet model led to all of these atrocities, therefore socialism is bad. Well, what you mean in the premise by socialism is the Soviet-style bottom-down command and control economy. What you mean by socialism in the conclusion, when you're saying that Richard Wolff should be cast out into the outer darkness, not to be discussed or debated with, is what Richard Wolff is advocating in the book. By the way, speaking of his profound ignorance and just lack of curiosity about the subjects that he's going on about, one of the things that I love about that video, now he says a lot of standard stupid right-wing things in there, like he uses Venezuela as an example of where Marxism is going wrong. Guys, the percentage of Venezuelans who work for the Venezuelan public sector is 18%. Right? So 82% of the Venezuelan workforce works for the private sector, 18% works for the public sector. To put that number into context, the number in France is 22%. The number in Norway is 29%. The number in the United States is 14%. So even if you simplistically equate state ownership with socialism, which I don't think you should do, I think that's analytically sloppy, but even if you do, and you're going to play that, game of seeing it as a matter of degree, and more socialist, less socialist, then Venezuela is 4% more socialist than the United States, and equally less socialist than, the Workers' Republic of France.
Right.
Which is led, of course, as we know, by glorious comrade, Macron, who's continuously doing things that we as socialists like and approve of.
And who I like Maduro better than.
Yeah, well, as you should.
Hot take, and it's true.
No, as you absolutely should. Maduro has done a lot of bad and authoritarian things. There are lots of grounds for legitimate criticism there. But I think what you should really take from those numbers is just how bad U.S. imperialism is in Latin America, that just to try to do a social democratic bare minimum, just to crawl up to this level of social democracy somewhere in between the U.S. and France, you have to withstand repeated coup attempts, years of lockouts, economic warfare, that things are on the brink of civil war because you have to do that. It's like when Aristide ran for president of Haiti the first time, and his slogan was that he was going to raise the Haitian people from misery to poverty, and he was subject to a military coup and removal after that, because in the U.S. sphere of influence, just attempting anything on behalf of the working class and the poor is going to, the entire weight of that edifice is going to be down in your head. One more empirical point about this I can't help but make here is that I found it really funny that he says that when he's listing off these, Stalinist countries, he just sort of casually says Cambodia, Vietnam, as
You
if
mean like
that's
U.S. proxy, the Khmer Rouge?
yeah, as if that's all the same thing.
Right.
That, when in fact, if you know just this much about history, you know that the United States was actually backing the Khmer Rouge against Vietnam, that communist Vietnam actually invaded Cambodia to stop Pol Pot's killing fields. Right. And when that happened, the U.S. backed the Khmer Rouge, for Cold War, anti-Vietnam reasons. And when I say that, that's not like some sort of that's not some kind of left-wing conspiracy theory. That's not even something that's like, buried somewhere. And,
No, that's in Samantha Power's book, dude.
Yeah.
This is highly common knowledge. Well, that's the thing. We're going to go to post-game in a few minutes, but one of the things that's a big theme in my book has a different track, obviously, of trying to diagnose the why of the appeals of these people, and then have this sort of answer of a kind of global identity socialism. But one of the things that really comes across, though, is that it's aggressively ahistorical. And it's not to say, if you're historically oriented, you can have different types of politics, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say if you wanted to create a really simplistic dividing line between any category of something you call left, anything, and any category of something that would fall into the right, and this is why the IDW is right wing, regardless of what specific policies people may or may not support.
Yeah.
It's a fundamentally right-wing premise to reject history as a mode of analysis and then try to naturalize existing orders through science or mythology. And that is the stuff that comes across with all of them. There's, you read Sam Harris, there's no reference to anything that's happened before, the 90s. I mean, I know the one Sam Harris person, they're like, no, this was a reference to an event in 1973 and you took him out of context and it's totally unfair. But it's a broad negation of history. And in that, I mean, he's shown, he doesn't know. I'm quite confident Jordan Peterson does not know that. He doesn't know what a proxy war in Cambodia is, because he was, reading about, I don't know, drumming circles or something.
Well, he was.
But these guys are fundamentally committed to eliminating historical analysis as unless it's just the most basic, not even National Review. I don't even know, just the most basic red baiting imaginable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And this actually does lead into an important point, because you're absolutely right. Most of these guys clearly know very little about history. Anytime they attempt to make a historical argument, it's always super shallow and superficial. My reference point here, I know that you were joking about it in the Majority Report once, was that discussion that I had a few months back on YouTube with some Jordan Peterson super fans.
Oh, I'm not sure about who those guys are.
Yeah.
Sorry, you'd have to. Don't refresh my memory.
Yeah. But the funny part about this,
about Fifis or something, but that's all I know.
Sure. But the funny part about this, and yes, they got a little upset about this. It's taken out of context, et cetera, et cetera. Which, by the way, sidebar, I think you'll find that the great communicators are the people who are constantly whining about being taken out of context.
That's how it works.
That's definitely a sign that you're good.
Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
Yeah,
like the whole time he's out of jail, he's like, I was taken out of context again. Another total distortion.
Typical Afrikaner media.
Fake news.
And I don't think those are bad guys, but I think that they're imitating what people like Jordan Peterson do, which is to say that, like, there was a point in that discussion when they started talking about the history of communism, and they want to kind of go down that route, Stalin's atrocities. So I did what I'd naturally do, which is to sort of start digging into the details. To say, well, hold on, guys, let's talk about the specific situations in these different countries. If we're going to have a conversation about it, right? And like their immediate instinct was to say, no, let's not get too deep in the weeds here.
Like, no, let's keep it very vague,
right? Which when I talk about like kind of reclaiming logic for the left, that really means two things, and one of them is like showing how you could make good explicit arguments for left-wing views, and showing how you can critique bad right-wing arguments. But the other, and I think in some ways actually more important, is reclaiming the actual enterprise of using logic in political debates from the ridiculous way that the IDW types use it. That like the people who make the biggest deal about logic, they mean all of these things that not only are not inherent to like caring about logic and making sure you're not going to be in logical fallacies and all of that stuff, but are actually antithetical to it. So in other words, one of the things they really that like people who make a big deal about logic tend to be people who don't want to get into the history, don't want to get into the empirical stuff. They just want to have like, hey, here are 2 or 3 like first principles, and we're going to like extrapolate everything from that.
Right.
But of course, there's nothing about the project of being careful about reasoning and trying to reason well that tells you to do that. In fact, if you're doing that, you're reasoning badly, right? A historical argument is an argument. A sociological argument is an argument. And these are tools that can help you make better historical and sociological arguments. And
how about no?
And
how about suck my dick?
And conversely,
or the famous Sam Harris in exchange with Ezra Klein, while he's literally defending like discredited racist science, quote unquote science, to say the history is irrelevant.
Yeah.
In a plaintive, whiny tone. All right, guys, we're going to go to the post game. I think you've gotten actually a great argument as to why this matters, everybody. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to read an early version of it, but of course you're going to want to buy Ben's book as soon as it comes out. I love the cover art too. The guy with the powdered wig, and Ben Shapiro's there like saying some bullshit, and the guy's just like, shh.
Yeah, that's
like that.
Shout out to Ryan Lake, who is a friend of mine and does like a pretty popular philosophy webcomic, who put together that cover image for us. David Hume hushing Ben Shapiro.
That's awesome. Guys, it's time to become a patron. We'll see you in the post game if you do. We're going to talk about Joe Biden. We're going to talk about the what is it, Matt? Niskanen. Hillary Clinton is going to try to undermine Bernie Sanders. That's a bummer. So we'll have to talk about that. Barry Weiss deployed some logic on The View. And we've got your Discord questions and calls and everything else. Patreon.com/TMBS. Get your tickets to the LA live show. See you soon.